Chapter 1.15, Part 2 of Personal Narrative of Travels to the Equinoctial Regions of America during the years 1799 to 1804, Volume 1, by Alexander von Humboldt, translated by Thomasina Ross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 1.15, Part 2. The valley of San Pedro, through which flows the river of the same name, separates two great masses of mountains, the Higuerota and Las Cucuizas. We ascended westward in the direction of the small farms of Las Luganetos and Garabatos. These are solitary houses, which serve as inns, and where the mule drivers obtain their favorite beverage, the guarapo, or fermented juice of the sugar cane. Intoxication is very common among the Indians who frequent this road. Near Garabatos there is a mica slate rock of singular form. It is a ridge, or steep wall, crowned by a tower. We opened the barometer at the highest point of the mountain, Las Cacuizas. Note, absolute height 845 toises, end of note, and found ourselves almost at the same elevation as on the tableland of Buena Vista, which is scarcely 10 toises higher. The prospect at Las Lagunetas is extensive, but rather uniform. This mountainous and uncultivated tract of ground between the sources of the Guaira and the Tuy is more than 25 square leagues in extent. We there found only one miserable village, that of Los Teques, southeast of San Pedro. The soil is, as it were, furrowed by a multitude of valleys, the smallest of which, parallel with each other, terminate at right angles in the largest valleys. The back of the mountains presents an aspect as monotonous as the ravines. It has no pyramidal forms, no ridges, no steep declivities. I am inclined to think that the undulation of this ground, which is for the most part very gentle, is less owing to the nature of the rocks, to the decomposition of the gneiss for instance, than to the long presence of the water and the action of currents. The limestone mountains of Cumana present the same phenomenon north of Tumiriquiri. From Las Lagunetas we descended into the valley of the river Tuy. This western slope of the mountains of Los Teques bears the name of Las Cacuizas, and is covered with two plants with agave leaves, the maguey of Cocuiza and the maguey of Cocuy. The latter belongs to the genus Yucca. Note, Yucca acollis hum. End of note. Its sweet and fermented juice yields a spirit by distillation, and I have seen the young leaves of this plant eaten. The fibers of the full-grown leaves furnish cords of extraordinary length. Note, at the clock of the Cathedral of Caracas, a cord of maguey, half an inch in diameter, sustained for 15 years a weight of 350 pounds. End of note. Leaving the mountains of the Higuerota and Los Teques, we entered a highly cultivated country covered with hamlets and villages, several of which would in Europe be called towns. From east to west, on a line 12 leagues in extent, we passed La Victoria, San Mateo, Turmero, and Maracay, containing together more than 28,000 inhabitants. The plains of the Tuy may be considered as the eastern extremity of the valleys of Aragua, extending from Guiana, on the borders of the lake of Valencia, as far as the foot of Las Cocuizas. A barometrical measurement gave me 295 toises for the absolute height of the Valle de Tuy, near the farm of Mantarola, and 222 toises for that of the surface of the lake. The river Tuy, flowing from the mountains of Las Cacuizas, runs first toward the west, then turning to the south and to the east. It takes its course along the high savannas of Ocumare, receives the waters of the valley of Caracas, and reaches the sea near Cape Codera. It is the small portion of its basin in the westward direction which, geologically speaking, would seem to belong to the valley of Aragua, if the hills of calcareous tufa, breaking the continuity of these valleys between Consejo and La Victoria, did not deserve some consideration. We shall here remind the reader that the group of the mountains of Los Teques, 850 toises high, separates two longitudinal valleys formed in gneiss, granite, and mica slate. The easternmost of these valleys, containing the capital of Caracas, is 200 toises higher than the western valley, which may be considered as the centre of agricultural industry. Having been for a long time accustomed to a moderate temperature, we found the plains of the Tuy extremely hot, although the thermometer kept in the daytime, between 11 in the morning and 5 in the afternoon, at only 23 or 24 degrees. The nights were delightfully cool, the temperature falling as low as 17.5 degrees. As the heat gradually abated, the air became more and more fragrant with the odour of flowers. We remarked above all the delicious perfume of the lirio hermosa, Pancratium undulatum, a new species of pancratium, of which the flower, 8 or 9 inches long, adorns the banks of the river Tuy. We spent 2 very agreeable days at the plantation of Don Jose de Manterola, who in his youth had accompanied the Spanish embassy to Russia. The farm is a fine plantation of sugar canes, and the ground is as smooth as the bottom of a drained lake. The Rio Tuy winds through districts covered with plantains, and a little wood of Hura crepitans, Erythrina corallodendron, and fig leaves with nymphea leaves. The bed of the river is formed of pebbles of quartz. I never met with more agreeable bathing than in the Tuy. The water, as clear as crystal, preserves even during the day a temperature of 18.6 degrees, a considerable coolness for these climates, and for a height of 300 toises, but the sources of the river are in the surrounding mountains. The house of the proprietor, situated on a hillock of 15 or 20 toises of elevation, is surrounded by the huts of the negroes. Those who are married provide food for themselves, and here, as everywhere else in the valleys of Aragua, a small spot of ground is allocated to them to cultivate. They labour on that ground on Saturdays and Sundays, the only days in the week on which they are free. They keep poultry, and sometimes even a pig. Their masters boast of their happiness, as in the north of Europe the great landowners love to descant upon the ease enjoyed by peasants who are attached to the glebe. On the day of our arrival we saw 3 fugitive negroes brought back. They were slaves newly purchased. I dreaded having to witness one of those punishments which, wherever slavery prevails, destroys all the charm of country life. Happily, these blacks were treated with humanity. In this plantation, as in all those of the province of Venezuela, 3 species of sugar cane can be distinguished even at a distance by the colour of their leaves: the old Creole sugar cane, the Otaheite cane, and the Batavia cane. The first has a deep green leaf, the stem not very thick, and the knots rather near together. The sugar cane was the first introduced from India into Sicily, the Canary Islands, and West Indies. The second is of a lighter green, and its stem is higher, thicker, and more succulent. The whole plant exhibits a more luxuriant vegetation. We owe this plant to the voyages of Bougainville, Cook, and Bligh. Bougainville carried it to the Mauritius, whence it passed to Cayenne, Martinique, and, since 1792, to the rest of the West India Islands. The sugar cane of Otaheite, called by the people of that island tow, is one of the most important acquisitions for which colonial agriculture is indebted to the travels of naturalists. It yields not only 1/3 more juice than the Creolian cane on the same space of ground, but from the thickness of its stem and the tenacity of its ligneous fibres, it furnishes much more fuel. This last advantage is important in the West Indies, where the destruction of the forests has long obliged the planters to use canes deprived of juice to keep up the fire under the boilers. But for the knowledge of this new plant, together with the progress of agriculture on the continent of Spanish America, and the introduction of the East India and Java sugar, the prices of colonial produce in Europe would have been much more sensibly affected by the revolutions of St. Domingo and the destruction of the great sugar plantations of that island. The Otaheite sugar cane was carried from the island of Trinidad to Caracas under the name of Cana Solera, and it passed from Caracas to Cucuta and San Gil in the kingdom of New Granada. In our days, its cultivation during 25 years has almost entirely removed the apprehension, at first entertained, that being transplanted to America, the cane would by degrees degenerate, and become as slender as the Creole cane. The third species, the violet sugar cane, called Cana de Batavia, or de Guinea, is certainly indigenous in the island of Java, where it is cultivated in preference in the districts of Japara and Pasuruan. Raffles' History of Java, Tome 1, page 124. Its foliage is purple and very broad, and this cane is preferred in the province of Caracas for rum. The tablones, or grounds, planted with sugar canes, are divided by hedges of a colossal gramen, the lata, or gynerium, with distich leaves. At the Tuy, men were employed in finishing a dike, to form a canal of irrigation. This enterprise had cost the proprietor 7,000 piastres for the expense of labour, and 4,000 piastres for the costs of lawsuits in which he had become engaged with his neighbours. While the lawyers were disputing about a canal of which only one half was finished, Don Jose de Manterola began to doubt even of the possibility of carrying the plan into execution. I took the level of the ground with a lunette d'épreuve on an artificial horizon, and found that the dam had been constructed 8 feet too low. What sums of money have I seen expended uselessly in the Spanish colonies for undertakings founded on erroneous levelling? The valley of the Tuy has its "gold mine," like almost every part of America inhabited by whites, and backed by primitive mountains. I was assured that in 1780 foreign gold gatherers had been engaged in picking up grains of that metal, and had established a place for washing the sand in the Quebrada del Oro. An overseer of a neighbouring plantation had followed these indications, and after his death, a waistcoat with gold buttons being found among his clothes, this gold, according to the logic of the people, could only have proceeded from a vein which the falling in of the earth had rendered invisible. In vain I objected that I could not, by the mere view of the soil, without digging a large trench in the direction of the vein, judge of the existence of the mine. I was compelled to yield to the desire of my hosts. For 20 years past, the overseer's waistcoat had been the subject of conversation in the country. Gold, extracted from the bosom of the earth, is far more alluring in the eyes of the vulgar than that which is the produce of agricultural industry, favoured by the fertility of the soil and the mildness of the climate. Northwest of the Hacienda del Tuy, in the northern range of the chain of the coast, we find a deep ravine called Quebrada Seca, because the torrent by which it was formed loses its waters through the crevices of the rock before it reaches the extremity of the ravine. The whole of this mountainous country is covered with thick vegetation. We here found the same verdure as had charmed us by its freshness in the mountains of Buena Vista and Las Lagunetas, wherever the ground rises as high as the region of the clouds, and where the vapours of the sea have free access. In the plains, on the contrary, many trees are stripped of a part of their leaves during the winter, and when we descend into the valley of the Tuy, we are struck with the almost hibernal aspect of the country. The dryness of the air is such that the hygrometer of Deluc keeps day and night between 36 and 40 degrees. At a distance from the river scarcely any huras or piper trees extend their foliage over thickets destitute of verdure. This seems owing to the dryness of the air, which attains its maximum in the month of February, and not, as the European planters assert, to the seasons of Spain, of which the empire extends as far as the torrid zone. It is only plants transported from one hemisphere to the other, which, in their organic functions, in the development of their leaves and flowers, still retain their affinity to a distant climate. Faithful to their habits, they follow for a long time the periodical changes of their native hemisphere. In the province of Venezuela, the trees stripped of their foliage begin to renew their leaves nearly a month before the rainy season. It is probable that at this period the electrical equilibrium of the air is already disturbed, and the atmosphere, although not yet clouded, becomes gradually more humid. The azure of the sky is paler, and the elevated regions are loaded with light vapours uniformly diffused. This season may be considered as the awakening of nature. It is a spring which, according to the received language of the Spanish colonies, proclaims the beginning of winter and succeeds to the heats of summer. Note: that part of the year most abundant in rain is called winter, so that in terra firma the season which begins by the winter solstice is designated by the name of summer, and it is usual to hear that it is winter on the mountains at the time when summer prevails in the neighbouring plains. Indigo was formerly cultivated in the Quebrada Seca, but as the soil covered with vegetation cannot there concentrate so much heat as the plains and the bottom of the Tuy valley receive and radiate, the cultivation of coffee has been substituted in its stead. As we advanced in the ravine, we found the moisture increase. Near the Hato, in the northern extremity of the Quebrada, a torrent rolls down over sloping beds of gneiss. An aqueduct was being formed there to convey the water to the plain. Without irrigation, agriculture makes no progress in these climates. A tree of monstrous size fixed our attention. Hura crepitans. It lay on the slope of the mountain, above the house of the Hato. On the least dislodgement of the earth, its fall would have crushed the habitation which it shaded. It had therefore been burnt near its foot, and cut down in such a manner that it fell between some enormous fig trees, which prevented it from rolling into the ravine. We measured the fallen tree, and though its summit had been burnt, the length of its trunk was still 140 feet. French measure, nearly 50 meters. It was 8 feet in diameter near the roots, and 4 feet 2 inches at the upper extremity. Our guides, less anxious than ourselves to measure the bulk of trees, continually pressed us to proceed onward and seek the gold mine. This part of the ravine is less frequented, and is not uninteresting. We made the following observations on the geological constitution of the soil. At the entrance of the Quebrada Seca, we remarked great masses of primitive saccharoidal limestone, tolerably fine-grained, of a bluish tint, and traversed by veins of calcareous spar of dazzling whiteness. These calcareous masses must not be confounded with the very recent depositions of tufa, or carbonate of lime, which fill the plains of the Tuy. They form beds of mica slate, passing into talc slate, Talkschiefer of Werner, without garnets or serpentine, not urite or weisstein. It is in the mountains of Buena Vista that the gneiss manifests a tendency to pass into urite. The primitive limestone often simply covers this latter rock in concordant stratification. Very near the Hato, the talcose slate becomes entirely white, and contains small layers of soft and unctuous graphitic ampelite, Zeichenschiefer. Some pieces, destitute of veins of quartz, are real granular plumbago, which might be of use in the arts. The aspect of the rock is very singular in those places where thin plates of black ampelite alternate with thin, sinuous, and satiny plates of a talcose slate as white as snow. It would seem as if the carbon and iron, which in other places colour the primitive rocks, are here concentrated in the subordinate strata. Turning westward, we reached at length the ravine of gold, Quebrada del Oro. On examining the slope of a hill, we could hardly recognize the vestige of a vein of quartz. The falling of the earth, caused by the rains, had changed the surface of the ground, and rendered it impossible to make any observation. Great trees were growing in the places where the gold washers had worked 25 years before. It is probable that the mica slate contains here, as near Goldkronach in Franconia and in Salzburg, auriferous veins. But how is it possible to judge whether they be worth the expense of being wrought, or whether the ore is only in nodules, and in the less abundance in proportion as it is rich? We made a long herborization in a thick forest, extending beyond the Hato, and abounding in cedrellas, brownias, and fig trees with nymphea leaves. The trunks of these last are covered with very odoriferous plants of vanilla, which in general flower only in the month of April. We were here again struck with those ligneous excrescences, which, in the form of ridges or ribs, augment to the height of 20 feet above the ground, the thickness of a trunk of the fig trees of America. I found trees 22 feet and a half in diameter near the roots. These ligneous ridges sometimes separate from the trunk at a height of 8 feet, and are transformed into cylindrical roots 2 feet thick. The tree looks as if it were supported by buttresses. The scaffolding, however, does not penetrate very deep into the earth. The lateral roots wind at the surface of the ground, and if at 20 feet distance from the trunk they are cut with a hatchet, we see gushing out the milky juice of the fig tree, which, when deprived of the vital influence of the organs of the tree, is altered and coagulates. What a wonderful combination of cells and vessels exist in these vegetable masses, in these gigantic trees of the torrid zone, which without interruption, perhaps during the space of 1,000 years, prepare nutritious fluids, raise them to a height of 180 feet, convey them down again to the ground, and conceal beneath the rough and hard bark, under inanimate layers of ligneous matter, all the movements of organic life. I availed myself of the clearness of the nights to observe at the plantation of Tuy 2 immersions of the first and third satellites of Jupiter. These 2 observations gave, according to the tables of Delambre, longitude 4 hours 39 minutes 14 seconds, and by the chronometer I found 4 hours 39 minutes 10 seconds. During my stay in the valleys of the Tuy and Aragua, the zodiacal light appeared almost every night with extraordinary brilliancy. I had perceived it for the first time between the tropics at Caracas on the 18th of January, after 7 in the evening. The point of the pyramid was at the height of 53 degrees. The light totally disappeared at 9 hours 35 minutes apparent time, nearly 3 hours 50 minutes after sunset, without any diminution in the serenity of the sky. Lacaille, in his voyage to Rio Janeiro and the Cape, was struck with the beautiful appearance displayed by the zodiacal light within the tropics, not so much on account of its less inclined position as of the greater transparency of the air. Note. The great serenity of the air caused this phenomenon to be remarked in 1668 in the arid plains of Persia. End of note. It may appear singular that Childrey and Dominic Cassini, navigators who were well acquainted with the seas of the two Indies, did not at a much earlier period direct the attention of scientific Europe to this light and its regular form and progress. Until the middle of the 18th century, mariners were little interested by anything not having immediate relation to the course of a ship and the demands of navigation. However brilliant the zodiacal light in the dry valley of Tuy, I have observed it more brilliant still at the back of the Cordilleras of Mexico, on the banks of the lake of Tezcuco, 1160 toises above the surface of the ocean. In the month of January, 1804, the light rose sometimes to more than 60 degrees above the horizon. The Milky Way appeared to grow pale compared with the brilliancy of the zodiacal light, and if small bluish scattered clouds were accumulated toward the west, it seemed as if the moon were about to rise. I must here relate another very singular fact. On the 18th of January and the 15th of February 1800, the intensity of the zodiacal light changed in a very perceptible manner at intervals of 2 or 3 minutes. Sometimes it was very faint, at others it surpassed the brilliancy of the Milky Way in Sagittarius. The changes took place in the whole pyramid, especially toward the interior, far from the edges. During these variations of the zodiacal light, the hygrometer indicated considerable dryness. The stars of the 4th and 5th magnitude appeared constantly to the naked eye with the same degree of light. No stream of vapour was visible. Nothing seemed to alter the transparency of the atmosphere. In other years, I saw the zodiacal light augment in the southern hemisphere half an hour before its disappearance. Cassini admitted, that the zodiacal light was feebler in certain years and then returned to its former brilliancy. He thought that these slow changes were connected with the same emanations which render the appearance of spots and faculae periodical on the solar disk. But this excellent observer does not mention those changes in intensity in the zodiacal light which I have several times remarked within the tropics, in the space of a few minutes. Mayran asserts that in France it is common enough to see the zodiacal light in the months of February and March, mingling with a kind of aurora borealis, which he calls undecided, and the nebulous matter of which spreads itself all around the horizon, or appears toward the west. I very much doubt whether, in the observations I have been describing, there was any mixture of these two species of light. The variations in intensity took place at considerable altitudes. The light was white and not coloured, steady and not undulating. Besides, the aurora borealis is so seldom visible within the tropics, that during 5 years, though almost constantly sleeping in the open air and observing the heavens with unremitting attention, I never perceived the least traces of that phenomenon. I am rather inclined to think that the variations of the zodiacal light are not all appearances dependent on certain modifications in the state of our atmosphere. Sometimes, during nights equally clear, I sought in vain for the zodiacal light, when, on the previous night, it had appeared with the greatest brilliancy. Must we admit that the emanations which reflect white light, and seem to have some analogy with the tails of comets, are less abundant at certain periods? Researches on the zodiacal light have acquired a new degree of interest, since geometricians have taught us that we are ignorant of the real causes of this phenomenon. The illustrious author of La Mécanique Céleste has shown that the solar atmosphere cannot reach even the planet Mercury, and that it could not in any case display the lenticular form which has been attributed to the zodiacal light. We may also entertain the same doubts respecting the nature of this light as with regard to that of the tail of comets. Is it in fact a reflected or a direct light? End of chapter 1.15, part 2. Chapter 1.15, Part 3, of Personal Narrative of Travels to the Equinoctial Regions of America during the years 1799 to 1804, Volume 1, by Alexander von Humboldt, translated by Thomasina Ross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 1.15, Part 3. We left the plantation of Monterola on the 11th of February at sunrise. The road runs along the smiling banks of the Tuy. The morning was cool and humid, and the air seemed embalmed by the delicious odour of the Pancratium undulatum and other large liliaceous plants. In our way to La Victoria, we passed the pretty village of Mamon, or of Consejo, celebrated in the country for a miraculous image of the Virgin. A little before we reached Mamon, we stopped at a farm belonging to the family of Monteras. A negress, more than 100 years old, was seated before a small hut built of earth and reeds. Her age was known because she was a Creole slave. She seemed still to enjoy very good health. "I keep her in the sun," "La tengo al sol," said her grandson. "The heat keeps her alive." This appeared to us not a very agreeable mode of prolonging life, for the sun was darting his rays almost perpendicularly. The brown-skinned nations, blacks well seasoned, and Indians, frequently attain a very advanced age in the torrid zone. A native of Peru, named Hilario Pari, died at the extraordinary age of 143 years, after having been 90 years married. Don Francisco Montera and his brother, a well-informed young priest, accompanied us with the view of conducting us to their house at La Victoria. Almost all the families with whom we had lived in friendship at Caracas were assembled in the fine valleys of Aragua, and they vied with each other in their efforts to render our stay agreeable. Before we plunged into the forests of the Orinoco, we enjoyed once more all the advantages which advanced civilization affords. The road from Mamon to La Victoria runs south and southwest. We soon lost sight of the river Tuy, which, turning eastward, forms an elbow at the foot of the high mountains of Guayraima. As we drew nearer to Victoria, the ground became smoother. It seemed like the bottom of a lake, the waters of which had been drained off. We might have fancied ourselves in the valley of Hasli, in the canton of Berne. The neighbouring hills, only 140 toises in height, are composed of calcareous tufa, but their abrupt declivities project like promontories on the plain. Their form indicates the ancient shore of the lake. The eastern extremity of this valley is parched and uncultivated. No advantage has been derived from the ravines which water the neighbouring mountains, but fine cultivation is commencing in the proximity of the town. I say of the town, though in my time Victoria was considered only as a village, pueblo. The environs of La Victoria present a very remarkable agricultural aspect. The height of the cultivated ground is from 270 to 300 toises above the level of the sea, and yet we there find fields of corn mingled with plantations of sugarcane, coffee, and plantains. Excepting the interior of the island of Cuba, the district of Cuatro Villas, we scarcely find elsewhere in the equinoctial regions European corn cultivated in large quantities in so low a region. The fine fields of wheat in Mexico are between 600 and 1200 toises of absolute elevation, and it is rare to see them descend to 400 toises. We shall soon perceive that the produce of grain augments sensibly from high latitudes toward the equator with the mean temperature of the climate, in comparing spots of different elevations. The success of agriculture depends on the dryness of the air, on the rains distributed through different seasons or accumulated in one season, on winds blowing constantly from the east, or bringing the cold air of the north into very low latitudes, as in the Gulf of Mexico, on mists, which for whole months diminish the intensity of the solar rays, in short, on 1,000 local circumstances, which have less influence on the mean temperature of the whole year than on the distribution of the same quantity of heat through the different parts of the year. It is a striking spectacle to see the grain of Europe cultivated from the equator as far as Lapland in the latitude of 69 degrees, in regions where the mean heat is from 22 to -2 degrees, in every place where the temperature of summer is above 9 or 10 degrees. We know the minimum of heat requisite to ripen wheat, barley, and oats, but we are less certain in respect to the maximum which these species of grain, accommodating as they are, can support. We are even ignorant of all the circumstances which favour the cultivation of corn within the tropics at very small heights. La Victoria and the neighbouring village of San Mateo yield an annual produce of 4,000 quintals of wheat. It is sown in the month of December, and the harvest is reaped on the 70th or 75th day. The grain is large, white, and abounding in gluten. Its pellicle is thinner and not so hard as that of the wheat of the very cold tablelands of Mexico. An acre, note, an arpent des eaux de forêt, or legal acre of France, of which 1.95 equals 1 hectare. It is about 1 1/4 acre English. End of note. Near Victoria generally yields from 3,000 to 3,200 pounds weight of wheat. The average produce is consequently here, as at Buenos Aires, 3 or 4 times as much as that of northern countries. Nearly 16-fold of the quantity of seed is reaped. While according to Lavoisier, the surface of France yields on an average only 5 or 6 for 1, or from 1,000 to 1,200 pounds per acre. Notwithstanding this fecundity of the soil, and this happy influence of the climate, the culture of the sugar cane is more productive in the valleys of Aragua than that of corn. La Victoria is traversed by the little river Calanchas, running, not into the Tuy, but into the Rio Aragua. It thence results that this fine country, producing at once sugar and corn, belongs to the basin of the lake of Valencia, to a system of interior rivers not communicating with the sea. The quarter of the town west of the Rio Calanchas is called La Otra Banda. It is the most commercial part. Merchandise is everywhere exhibited, and ranges of shops form the streets. 2 commercial roads pass through La Victoria, that of Valencia, or of Porto Cabello, and the road of Villa de Cura, or of the plains, called Camino de los Llanos. We here find more whites in proportion than at Caracas. We visited at sunset the little hill of Calvary, where the view is extremely fine and extensive. We discover on the west the lovely valleys of Aragua, a space covered with gardens, cultivated fields, clumps of wild trees, farms, and hamlets. Turning south and southeast, we see, extending as far as the eye can reach, the lofty mountains of La Palma, Guayraima, Tiara, and Guiripa, which conceal the immense plains or steppes of Calabozo. This interior chain stretches westward along the lake of Valencia toward the Villa de Cura, the Cuesta de Usma, and the denticulated mountains of Guiana. It is very steep and constantly covered with that light vapour which in hot climates gives a vivid blue tint to distant objects, and, far from concealing their outlines, marks them the more strongly. It is believed that among the mountains of the interior chain, that of Guayraima reaches an elevation of 1,200 toises. I found in the night of the 11th of February the latitude of La Victoria 10 degrees 13 minutes 35 seconds, the magnetic dip 40.8 degrees, the intensity of the forces equal to 236 oscillations in 10 minutes of time, and the variation of the needle 4.4 degrees northeast. We proceeded slowly on our way by the villages of San Mateo, Turmero, and Maracay, to the Hacienda de Cura, a fine plantation belonging to Count Tovar, where we arrived on the evening of the 14th of February. The valley, which gradually widens, is bordered with hills of calcareous tufa, called here Tierra Blanca. The scientific men of the country have made several attempts to calcine this earth, mistaking it for the porcelain earth proceeding from decomposed strata of feldspar. We stayed some hours with a very intelligent family named Ustariz at Concepcion. Their house, which contains a collection of choice books, stands on an eminence, and is surrounded by plantations of coffee and sugar cane. A grove of balsam trees, balsamo, note, Amarus elata, end of note, gives coolness and shade to this spot. It was gratifying to observe the great number of scattered houses in the valley inhabited by freed men. In the Spanish colonies, the laws, the institutions, and the manners are more favourable to the liberty of the negroes than in other European settlements. San Mateo, Turmero, and Maracay are charming villages, where everything denotes the comfort of the inhabitants. We seem to be transported to the most industrious districts of Catalonia. Near San Mateo we find the last fields of wheat, and the last mills with horizontal hydraulic wheels. a harvest of 20 for 1 was expected, and, as if that produce were but moderate, I was asked whether corn yielded more in Prussia and in Poland. By an error generally prevalent under the tropics, the produce of grain is supposed to degenerate in advancing towards the equator, and harvests are believed to be more abundant in northern climates. Since calculations have been made on the progress of agriculture in the different zones, and on the temperatures under the influence of which corn will flourish, it has been found that, beyond the latitude of 45 degrees, the produce of wheat is nowhere so considerable as on the northern coasts of Africa, on the tablelands of New Grenada, Peru, and Mexico. Without comparing the mean temperature of the whole year, but only the mean temperature of the season which embraces the corn cycle of vegetation, we find, for 3 months of summer, in the north of Europe, from 15 to 19 degrees, in Barbary and Egypt, from 27 to 29 degrees, within the tropics, between 14 and 300 toises of height, from 14 to 25.5 degrees of the centigrade thermometer. Note: the mean heat of the summers of Scotland, in the environs of Edinburgh, latitude 56 degrees, is found again on the tablelands of New Grenada, so rich in wheat, at 1400 toises of elevation, and at 4 degrees north latitude. On the other hand, we find the mean temperature of the valleys of Aragua, latitude 10 degrees 13 minutes, and of all the plains, which are not very elevated in the torrid zone, in the summer temperature of Naples and Sicily, latitude 39 to 40 degrees. These figures indicate the situation of the isothermic lines, lines of the same summer heat, and not those of the isothermal lines, those of equal annual temperature. Considering the quantity of heat received on the same spot of the globe during a whole year, the mean temperatures of the valleys of Aragua and the tablelands of New Grenada, at 300 and 1400 toises of elevation, correspond to the mean temperature of the coasts at 23 and 45 degrees of latitude. End of note. The fine harvests of Egypt and Algiers, as well as those of the valleys of Aragua and the interior of the island of Cuba, sufficiently prove that the augmentation of heat is not prejudicial to the harvest of wheat and other alimentary grain, unless it be attended with an excess of drought or moisture. To this circumstance, no doubt, we must attribute the apparent anomalies sometimes observed within the tropics, in the lower limit of corn. We are astonished to see, eastward of Havana, in the famous district of Cuatro Villas, that this limit descends almost to the level of the ocean, whilst west of the Havana, on the slope of the mountains of Mexico and Jalapa, at 677 toises of height, the luxuriance of vegetation is such that wheat does not form ears. At the beginning of the Spanish conquest, the corn of Europe was cultivated with success in several regions, now supposed to be too hot or too damp for this branch of agriculture. The Spaniards, on their first removal to America, were little accustomed to live on maize. They still adhered to their European habits. They did not calculate whether corn would be less profitable than coffee or cotton. They tried seeds of every kind, making experiments the more boldly because their reasons were less founded on false theories. The province of Cartagena, crossed by the chain of mountains Maria and Guamoco, produced wheat till the 16th century. In the province of Caracas, this culture is of very ancient date in the mountainous lands of Tocuyo, Quibor, and Barquisimeto, which connect the littoral chain of the Sierra Nevada of Merida. Wheat is still successfully cultivated there, and environs of the town of Tocuyo alone export annually more than 8,000 quintals of excellent flour. But though the province of Caracas, in its vast extent, includes several spots very favourable to the cultivation of European corn, I believe that in general this branch of agriculture will never acquire any great importance there. The most temperate valleys are not sufficiently wide. They are not real tablelands, and their mean elevation above the level of the sea is not so considerable but that the inhabitants cannot fail to perceive that it is more their interest to establish plantations of coffee than to cultivate corn. Flour now comes to Caracas either from Spain or from the United States. The village of Turmero is 4 leagues distant from San Mateo. The road leads through plantations of sugar, indigo, cotton, and coffee. The regularity observable in the construction of the villages reminded us that they all owe their origin to monks and missions. The streets are straight and parallel, crossing each other at right angles, and the church is invariably erected in the great square, situated in the centre of the village. The church of Turmero is a fine edifice, but overloaded with architectural ornaments. Since the missionaries have been replaced by vicars, the whites have mingled their habitations with those of the Indians. The latter are gradually disappearing as a separate race. That is to say, they are represented in the general statement of the population by the mestizos and the zambos, whose numbers daily increase. I still found, however, 4,000 tributary Indians in the valleys of Aragua. Those of Turmero and Guacara are the most numerous. They are of small stature, but less squat than the Chaymas. Their eyes denote more vivacity and intelligence, owing less perhaps to a diversity in the race than to a superior state of civilization. They work like freemen by the day. Though active and laborious during the short time they allot to labour, yet what they earn in 2 months is spent in 1 week, in the purchase of strong liquors at the small inns, of which, unhappily, the numbers daily increase. We saw at Turmero the remains of the assembled militia of the country, and their appearance alone sufficiently indicated that these valleys had enjoyed for ages undisturbed peace. The Capitan General, in order to give a new impulse to the military service, had ordered a grand review, and the battalion of Turmero, in a mock fight, had fired on that of La Victoria. Our host, a lieutenant of the militia, was never weary of describing to us the danger of these manoeuvres, which seemed more burlesque than imposing. With what rapidity do nations, apparently the most pacific, acquire military habits! 12 years afterwards, those valleys of Aragua, those peaceful plains of La Victoria and Turmero, the defile of Cabrero, and the fertile banks of the lake of Valencia became the scenes of obstinate and sanguinary conflicts between the natives and the troops of the mother country. South of Turmero, a mass of limestone mountains advances into the plain, separating 2 fine sugar plantations, Guayavita and Paja. The latter belongs to the family of Count Tovar, who have property in every part of the province. Near Guayavita, brown iron ore has been discovered. To the north of Turmero, a granitic summit, the Chuao, rises in the Cordillera of the coast, from the top of which we discern at once the sea and the lake of Valencia. Crossing this rocky ridge, which runs toward the west farther than the eye can reach, paths somewhat difficult lead to the rich plantations of cacao on the coast, to Choroni, Turiamo, and Acumari, noted alike for the fertility of the soil and the insalubrity of their climate. Turmero, Maracay, Cura, Guacara, every point of the valley of Aragua, has its mountain road, which terminates at one of the small ports on the coast. On quitting the village of Turmero, we discover, at a league distant, an object which appears at the horizon like a round hillock or tumulus, covered with vegetation. It is neither a hill nor a group of trees close to each other, but one single tree, the famous Zamang del Guayra, known throughout the province for the enormous extent of its branches, which form a hemispheric head 567 feet in circumference. The zamang is a fine species of mimosa, and its tortuous branches are divided by bifurcation. Its delicate and tender foliage was agreeably relieved on the azure of the sky. We stopped for a long time under this vegetable roof. The trunk of the Zamang del Guayra, note, the mimos of La Guayra, zamang, being the Indian name for the genera Mimosa, Desmanthus, and Acacia. The place where the tree is found is called El Guayra, end of note, which is found on the road from Turmero to Maracay, is only 60 feet high and 9 thick, but its real beauty consists in the form of its head. The branches extend like an immense umbrella, and bend toward the ground, from which they remain at a uniform distance of 12 or 15 feet. The circumference of this head is so regular, that having traced different diameters, I found them 192 and 186 feet. One side of the tree was entirely stripped of its foliage, owing to the drought, but on the other side there remained both leaves and flowers. Tillandsias, Loranthia, Cactus pitihaya, and other parasite plants covered its branches and cracked the bark. The inhabitants of these villages, but particularly the Indians, hold in veneration the Zamang del Guayra, which the first conquerors found almost in the same state in which it now remains. Since it has been observed with attention, no change has appeared in its thickness or height. This zamang must be at least as old as the Orotava dragon tree. There is something solemn and majestic in the aspect of aged trees, and the violation of these monuments of nature is severely punished in countries destitute of monuments of art. We heard with satisfaction that the present proprietor of the zamang had brought an action against a cultivator who had been guilty of cutting off a branch. The cause was tried, and the tribunal condemned the offender. We find near Tobago and the Hacienda de Cura other zamangs, having trunks larger than that of Guayra, but their hemispherical heads are not of equal extent. The culture and population of the plains augment in the direction of Cura and Guacara, on the northern side of the lake. The valleys of Aragua contain more than 52,000 inhabitants, on a space 13 leagues in length and 2 in width. This is a relative population of 2,000 souls on a square league. The village, or rather the small town of Maracay, was hitherto the centre of the indigo plantations, when this branch of colonial industry was at its greatest prosperity. The houses are all of masonry, and every court contains cocoa trees, which rise above the habitations. The aspect of general wealth is still more striking at Maracay than at Turmero. The anil, or indigo, of these provinces has always been considered in commerce as equal and sometimes superior to that of Guatemala. The indigo plant impoverishes the soil, where it is cultivated during a long series of years, more than any other. The lands of Maracay, Tapatapa, and Turmero are looked upon as exhausted, and indeed the produce of indigo has been constantly decreasing. But in proportion as it has diminished in the valleys of Aragua, it has increased in the provinces of Varinas, and in the burning plains of Cucuta, where, on the banks of the Rio Tachira, virgin land yields an abundant produce of the richest colour. We arrived very late at Maracay, and the persons to whom we were recommended were absent. The inhabitants perceived our embarrassment, contended with each other in offering to lodge us, to place our instruments, and take care of our mules. It has been said 1,000 times, but the traveller always feels desirous of repeating it again, that the Spanish colonies are the land of hospitality. They are so even in those places where industry and commerce have diffused wealth and improvement. A family of Canarians received us with the most amiable cordiality. An excellent repast was prepared, and everything was carefully avoided that might act as any restraint on us. The master of the house, Don Alejandro Gonzalez, was travelling on commercial business, and his young wife had lately had the happiness of becoming a mother. She was transported with joy when she heard that on our return from the Rio Negro we should proceed by the banks of the Orinoco to Angostura, where her husband was. We were to bear to him the tidings of the birth of his first child. In those countries, as among the ancients, travellers are regarded as the safest means of communication. There are indeed posts established, but they make such great circuits that private persons seldom entrust them with letters for the llanos or savannas of the interior. The child was brought to us at the moment of our departure. We had seen him asleep at night, but it was deemed indispensable that we should see him awake in the morning. We promised to describe his features exactly to his father, but the sight of our books and instruments somewhat chilled the mother's confidence. She said, quote, that in a long journey, amidst so many cares of another kind, we might well forget the colour of her child's eyes. End quote. On the road from Maracay to the Hacienda de Cura, we enjoyed from time to time the view of the Lake of Valencia. An arm of the granitic chain of the coast stretches southward into the plain. It is the promontory of Portachuelo, which would almost close the valley, were it not separated by a narrow defile from the rock of La Cabrera. This place has acquired a sad celebrity in the late revolutionary wars of Caracas, each party having obstinately disputed its position as opening the way to Valencia and to the Llanos. La Cabrera now forms a peninsula. Not 60 years ago it was a rocky island in the lake, the waters of which gradually diminish. We spent 7 very agreeable days at the Hacienda de Cura, in a small habitation surrounded by thickets. We lived after the manner of the rich in this country. We bathed twice, slept 3 times, and made 3 meals in the 24 hours. The temperature of the water of the lake is rather warm, being from 24 to 25 degrees. But there is another cool and delicious bathing place at Toma, under the shade of cebas and large zamangs, in a torrent gushing from the granitic mountains of the Rincon del Diablo. In entering this bath, we had not to fear the sting of insects, but to guard against the little brown hairs which cover the pods of the Dolichos pruriens. When these small hairs, well characterized by the name of pica pica, stick to the body, they excite a violent irritation on the skin. The dart is felt, but the cause is unperceived. Near Cura, we found all the people occupied in clearing the ground covered with mimosa, sterculia, and Coccoloba excoriata, for the purpose of extending the cultivation of cotton. This product, which partly supplies the place of indigo, has succeeded so well during some years, that the cotton tree now grows wild on the borders of the lake of Valencia. We have found shrubs of 8 or 10 feet high, entwined with bignonia and other ligneous creepers. The exportation of cotton from Caracas, however, is yet of small importance. It amounted at an average at La Guaira scarcely to 300,000 or 400,000 pounds in a year, but including all the ports of the Capitania General, it arose, on account of the flourishing culture of Cariaco, Nueva Barcelona, and Maracaibo, to more than 22,000 quintals. The cotton of the valleys of Aragua is of fine quality, being inferior only to that of Brazil, for it is preferred to that of Cartagena, St. Domingo, and the Canary Islands. The cultivation of cotton extends on one side of the lake from Maracay to Valencia, and on the other from Guega to Guiana. The large plantations yield from 60,000 to 70,000 pounds a year. During our stay at Cura, we made numerous excursions to the rocky islands, which rise in the midst of the lake of Valencia, to the warm springs of Mariara, and to the lofty granitic mountain called El Cucurucho de Coco. A dangerous and narrow path leads to the port of Turiamo and the celebrated cacao plantations of the coast. In all these excursions we were agreeably surprised, not only at the progress of agriculture, but at the increase of a free laborious population, accustomed to toil, and too poor to rely on the assistance of slaves. White and mulatto farmers had everywhere small separate establishments. Our host, whose father had a revenue of 40,000 piastres, possessed more lands than he could clear. He distributed them in the valleys of Aragua among poor families who chose to apply themselves to the cultivation of cotton. He endeavoured to surround his ample plantations with free men, who, working as they chose, either in their own land or in the neighbouring plantations, supplied him with day labourers at the time of harvest. Nobly occupied on the means best adapted gradually to extinguish the slavery of the blacks in these provinces, Count Tovar flattered himself with the double hope of rendering slaves less necessary to the landholders, and furnishing the free men with opportunities of becoming farmers. On departing for Europe, he had parcelled out and let a part of the lands of Cura, which extend towards the west at the foot of the rock of Las Viruelas. 4 years after, at his return to America, he found on this spot, finely cultivated in cotton, a little hamlet of 30 or 40 houses, which is called Punta Zamuro, and which we visited with him. The inhabitants of this hamlet are almost all mulattoes, zambos, or free blacks. This example of letting out land has been happily followed by several other great proprietors. The rent is 10 piastres for a fanega of ground, and is paid in money or in cotton. As the small farmers are often in want, they sell their cotton at a very moderate price. They dispose of it even before the harvest, and the advances made by rich neighbours place the debtor in a situation of dependence, which frequently obliges him to offer his services as a labourer. The price of labour is cheaper here than in France. A free man working as a day labourer, peon, is paid in the valleys of Aragua, and in the llanos 4 or 5 piastres per month, not including food, which is very cheap on account of the abundance of meat and vegetables. I love to dwell on these details of colonial industry, because they serve to prove to the inhabitants of Europe a fact which to the enlightened inhabitants of the colonies has long ceased to be doubtful, namely, that the continent of Spanish America can produce sugar, cotton, and indigo by free hands, and that the unhappy slaves are capable of becoming peasants, farmers, and landholders. End of section 1.15, part 3. End of volume 1 of the personal narrative of travels to the equinoctial regions of America during the years 1799 to 1804, Volume 1. Read by Gail Timmerman-Vaughan during 2015 and 2016.